Hi, thank you for joining this webinar on startups and the challenges and opportunities of working for a startup. I've worked at two different startups within financial services, utilising my skills that I learned from working with large blue chip multinationals. The first of these startups was an asset management firm. There was a group of analysts who bought stocks and shares, and I was the office manager who was brought in to help this team when they were first starting out. The next one I worked at was a company called ThinCats, who were in the SME lending space. So they lent money to small businesses, typically who were a few years old. I realised that working for one of these startups, you needed access to a lot of new tools and new systems. And I realised that Google isn't really helpful when you're looking for something like a CRM or a project management tool. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of these, all of this kind of tech. And so I didn't know where to start. I made lots of mistakes, and when I was trying to set up the small business admin network, I was trying to help people not make the same mistakes that I made. So I set up the small business admin network in November 2019, and I took all of the suppliers and contacts who had helped me in those early days of those two startups, and I brought them all together into one place. I then changed industry back in February 2020, so only a couple of months ago from when I'm filming this webinar. I work in aerospace now, and it's completely different to financial services. And it reminded me of when I started my first job for a stockbroking firm when I was just 18. There were a lot of acronyms that I didn't understand, and so many companies that I'd never heard of. A lot of these companies that I'd never heard of were our clients and competitors. Now I'm working for this company, it's pronounced ISI. I'm working with people who have been at this company for as long as I'd been at my previous company. I'm no longer part of the furniture there like I had been in my previous role. I have no context of where this company had started, where it's come from, or why things are done in a certain way. However, that doesn't necessarily matter because they've brought me in to help scale up this business. They're looking at me as an expert in my field to show them how to do things. So, what is a startup? It's typically a company that's working to solve a problem where the solution isn't necessarily obvious. Success definitely is not guaranteed, as 20% of small businesses fail in their first year, 30% failing in their second year, and a huge 50% failing after 5 years. So if anything, failure is more of a guarantee than success is. It's also a state of mind. When people join your company, they are making the explicit decision to forego stability in exchange for the promise of tremendous growth and the excitement of making an immediate impact. We all want to be part of the next Amazon or Google. There's a new company, but what defines new? Generally speaking, a company 5 years old or less can be a startup. It can be a bit flexible, but 10 years is probably a bit of a stretch. A lot of businesses are run from laptops and kitchen tables for the first couple of years. So on paper, they've already failed and are likely to be funded by the permanent salary of the founder and are probably not making any money at all. To give you a bit of context, I've spent over £1,000 setting up the small business admin network, and that's not even including any of my time. So I'm lucky that I know exactly which tools to use to build the best website. And so I don't have to pay for a developer either. Most startups scale very quickly. You often hear about triple-digit growth for the first few years, but this is unsustainable, certainly unless you put measures in place to scale your business properly. One of the things that I focus on in my current role at ISI is scalability. These processes that I'm putting in place, they're great now, but can they cope with a tenfold increase in business? If not, I'm just setting myself up to fail. But this isn't something that an established business needs to think about, because a tenfold increase in business is simply not going to happen to someone like Tesco's or HSBC. So some people consider a company to no longer be a startup when it turns into profitability. However, if you're a service-based company of perhaps just one person, profitability can come relatively quickly because your overheads typically are quite low. What about when there's a takeover? When one company is bought by another, you can generally be sure that that company is no longer in startup territory when they are sort of enveloped or taken over by another company. Or an IPO. So an IPO is an initial public offering, and that's when a company first gets listed on the stock market. Now, there is a specific stock market for newer companies called AIM, but even then, you wouldn't be classed as a startup if you're being listed on the stock market. So just going back to my startup journey in the early days of when I worked at ThinCats. So I was employee number 7. When I started, we didn't even have our own office. We were set up in a meeting room from our parent company, and we didn't have computers or phones when I started. So I had to take in my own laptop and use my own Gmail account, which is incredibly difficult when you're trying to contact people for the meetings. People don't think you're a real company if you use your Gmail account. So I got to use my skills here, sort of my gatekeeping skills in reverse, to try and get through to people. We didn't do much international travel. When we were a couple of months old, a couple of my team needed to go to Amsterdam to speak to a company that we were looking at buying. Having come from a background that's been really heavy on the corporate process side, I was now in a position where I had to book this whole business trip where we didn't have a travel management company, no policies, no preferred suppliers. It was actually quite liberating. There was no out of policy forms to fill out because they were travelling with one airline and back with another. No need to no requirements to having to explain that I'd booked them into a hotel 5 miles away, even though it's more expensive. I was able to book them into a hotel right next door to where the meeting was. Now, this was quite difficult for people who didn't have a corporate background. I was constantly being asked if we were allowed to do things. Even people who were more senior than me were asking for guidance and validation that they were doing the right thing. So I took it upon myself to take ownership of giving permission. I also started writing down some of the policies and procedures that we were going to need. I would get back to these a bit later, but I was trying to find us a new office. I was very used to being constrained to pretty much every policy and procedure under the sun, so I knew which ones we were going to need at a later date. So looking at some of the key skills I was using in these early days, adaptability, it's used quite a lot in our admin roles, but this was like nothing else. The company was changing on a daily basis. At one point there was a new starter pretty much every week, and it was really easy to forget that they were at the start of their journey while I was ultimately in the middle of mine. We all talk about no 2 days being the same and having to change things at the last minute. So as experienced administrative teams, we are already used to that. But again, this is taking things to a whole different level. There aren't teams of people looking after specific things like I was used to when I was working for a large investment bank. There wasn't even another person to ask. It was just me I was looking after everything that wasn't sales or equity raising. So one day, the most important thing on your plate is looking for a new office. And the next day it might be to find a printing company to print out your company prospectuses, because the printer that you have in the office is just one that somebody had spare at home. The confidence. Now, we all need to be confident in our abilities, in our roles, and that's an absolute given. But here I was being given the task of finding a new office for my colleagues, and the entire responsibility was on my shoulders. And not just the office, it was the IT setup, the desks, the internet. My goodness, the internet caused me the biggest headache in those early days. We moved to an office which was being knocked down within about 7 months, so we couldn't set up an internet contract with one of the major internet providers. Everyone else in the business, in the building, were on their way out, so there wasn't even anybody who had internet that we could sort of borrow. So I had to sort this problem out. Going into this office was meant to be giving me a bit of breathing space while I found something permanent, but it actually did the opposite. If I needed somebody to go to, or to ask for their help or guidance, I would have just fallen flat on my face. I needed to have the confidence and belief that what I was doing was my best and the most appropriate thing for the company. Making the best decision you can with the information you have at the time is all you can do. I've told this story of moving into a new office to people before, and they often respond by telling me that, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that, my friend did this, my friend did that. But I didn't have that information at the time. I can't go back in time and change anything. So, you know, I'm 100% confident that I did the best that I could. Having the ability to learn, working in a startup, means that you'll need to learn how to do a lot of new things, a lot of things that you might not realise even exist when you start. And to be honest, this is where the idea came from for me to first set up the Small Business Admin Network. My blog is actually called "You Don't Know What You Don't Know," which is one of my favourite sayings. Plus, the chances are that this startup exists because the founders want to try something new or a bit different. So there's a high chance that what they're trying to do is a bit disruptive. So it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be things that you need to do that you probably haven't needed to do in the past. For me personally, working at a startup in the lending space, I had to learn what it meant to get regulated by the FCA, who are the financial regulatory body in the UK. I had to learn how to write copy. I had to learn the importance of disclaimers on documents. I also had to work out how to employ a graduate who joined us for the summer before we'd even had the company incorporated or had any kind of payroll function. You also need to learn how to train your boss. Now, I was exceptionally fortunate that the CEO of ThinCats had a PA in his previous role. Even more fortunate, that PA was me. A lot of founders and startups have never had any kind of office support. So it's really, really key to be able to show them what you can do. On top of that, a lot of company founders will have had to do everything themselves in those early days of sitting with their laptop on the kitchen table. So it's even more difficult for them to give up some of that control. So a lot of this means building trust with them and learning how they work. Now, Lucy recently put out some information on email triage that her and Matt use. And this is exactly the kind of thing you need to be going to your boss with. If you've not heard about it, it basically involves you filing your boss's emails into 4 or 5 different folders so that he or she can prioritise really, really effectively. So go and check it out because it's so simple, it's so brilliant. You also need a can-do attitude. Now, I don't like this term particularly, but just bear with me. So in a startup, generally there's not going to be much structure. There's not going to be clear guidelines on your career progression. You're likely to not have any formal performance reviews, and you may as well not have a job description because it's going to change so much. But if you're one of those people who likes formality and structure, you're going to initially quite struggle working for a startup, but that does not mean you can't work at one, and it definitely doesn't mean you can't be really successful at one. My recommendation here is to give yourself a time each day to deal with some of the unexpected things. Perhaps half an hour each day, again, to learn something about the industry. Read up on some of your competitors. Read about what's happened in the news. The more you know about your industry and your sector, the more comfortable you're going to feel. You're also going to have to roll up your sleeves and just do whatever needs to be done, whether that's crawling under the boardroom table to tidy up all the video conferencing cables, or popping to the shop to buy a doorbell because no one hears the delivery person knocking at the door, or even speak to marketing to get them to create a company presentation that you can play on the TV in the waiting area because people are getting a bit sick of BBC News. You have to use your initiative because people are dependent on you to think of these things. And a startup, you have to think of yourself as the head of administration or some kind of manager, because that's exactly what you are, even if you don't have the job title to reflect. So there's something quite scary moving your team into a new office, which is effectively a blank canvas, especially if you're like me and you have the creative prowess of a rock. So I enlisted the help of a conveyancer who sent me a whole load of potential offices. It's like buying a house, to be honest. There's so many different things to consider. The location, the number of meeting rooms, the office layout, facilities, was there a kitchen, was there enough toilets? There was also a major dilemma of how big the office space needs to be. We're a startup. When I was asked how many people needed to be in the office, I had no idea. Nobody had any idea. At that point, we were about 12 people. This time next year, we could be 12 still. We could be 50. So we needed flexible space, or at least cheap space. And I didn't want us to have to move again in 6 months' time, although that's pretty much what I ended up doing. We moved into a really basic office, but it had the most spectacular views. We were on the 18th floor in a block over in Marble Arch, which, for those of you who don't know where Marble Arch is, it's just one end of Oxford Street, right in the middle of London, and you had these spectacular views over Hyde Park. It was absolutely beautiful. And to be honest, that view was a saving grace, because anyone walking into our office was so in awe of that view, they were completely oblivious to the fact that we had rented furniture and still didn't have any phones. So we did finally get some internet when we moved in, but it was a temporary solution that cut out every time that I was out of the office, mostly because we had to top it up. Yes, we actually had pay-as-you-go internet, and it was as horrific as it sounds. I had to sort out all our contractors, and we had to have contracts with cleaning company to make sure our office was cleaned every night. And I had to buy things like the kettle, and I had to replace the fridge because it didn't work. I also had to be conscious that this office was not going to be our home for very long. The whole office was being knocked down, so I had to start looking for somewhere else pretty much as soon as we moved in. So what were these key skills as the company moved forward a little bit? The first one, problem solving. And oh my goodness, we have a lot of problems. Like when you're speaking to a printing company trying to negotiate a printing contract, and they deliver a full-sized floor-standing printer the very next day while you are not in the office. Your colleagues think they're all helping by getting it up to the 18th floor, but it gets stuck in the fire escape, and they just leave it there for you to deal with the next day when you come back. The building manager goes absolutely berserk because you've blocked the fire escape, and you end up having to remove the door frame so it can fit through the door into the office. And you still haven't paid for this printer, or agreed a contract, or had the budget signed off by management. Luckily, they all thought it was hilarious and had much bigger things to worry about than a printer, but I was utterly mortified. Delegating. So yes, the one skill that we as admin assistants are notoriously terrible at. We are control freaks. We love to know what's going on. And for quite a lot of us, we find it very, very difficult to say no. But delegation must be your friend when you're working in a company which is growing at a rate which most startups are. So it was at that point that I was able to hire an assistant to work with me. So this was the first time I had been a line manager to someone. And so this leads me quite seamlessly onto my next key skill, which is management. Even if you're not hiring an assistant just yet, you might not even get to that point ever. but you still need to be able to manage your colleagues. You need to be able to position yourself to be able to command enough authority so that they will do what you ask them to. Whether that's clearing out of a meeting room because you've got clients coming in, or making them pack up their desks by 3 p.m. on moving day because the removal people are arriving. They have to trust you, and that means only asking them to do things that are absolutely necessary. So before you ask them to do anything, just double check what you're asking. Make them understand that you are asking them to do something for a very good reason. One of the little tricks I really like using is to ask them for help with something really small first. Ask for maybe getting a box off of a high shelf, or asking for a pen. And make sure you thank them profusely afterwards, and they'll feel quite warm and happy that they've been able to help you out. When you go to ask them to do something again, their brains are going to associate that warm feeling of gratitude you gave them beforehand and are going to be much more likely to help you again. So, settling down. We did eventually settle down. I found our new office and I had to start the whole journey of designing it. You remember I said earlier that I had the creative skills of a rock, so I delegated the design and left it to the experts. I did, however, incorporate some of the comments and complaints and observations that I'd taken from the other 2 spaces that we had been in already, and I tried to incorporate them into the new office. We had to have lots of meeting rooms. I could not have my colleagues sitting in the reception area having meetings anymore. We had to have lots of cupboard space because as hard as you try to make offices paperless, clutter-free, people are hoarders. They want to keep printouts of emails, they want to keep random letters that have never opened, as well as every single free stress ball they've ever received from every conference they've ever been to. I also had to think about the corporate branding of the office, the colours, the logos, that kind of thing. I had a chance to think about the nice to haves in the office, like water coolers, the company colours incorporated into our furniture and decoration. And also it was really fun to work out the layout of the office and who was going to sit where. One of my tips, if you're organising an office, do not let everyone get involved with organising the floor plan. Everyone will have a say. No one will be happy. Just tell them where they need to sit, and then you'll have much fewer complaints and arguments. Another piece of advice is you can never have too many meeting rooms. People will always find a reason to use them, even if it's just for taking phone calls, personal phone calls, or having lunch somewhere quiet. A lack of meeting rooms is going to cause you more stress than you need. When we moved into this office, we had 6 meeting rooms, and within a few months they were regularly all full. So one of my proudest moments of my career is the day all my colleagues arrived and moved into that office. Seeing them notice and appreciate all the things that I'd done really was worth the effort. It was a bit like when you make Christmas lunch for your family and you see them sitting around the table and laughing and joking and enjoying all of your food. All of those late nights and early mornings really were worth it. And for that feeling alone, I would do that all over again. So you really can't do everything, as much as we all love to think that we can. I soon learned that although I was the office manager and I had to be responsible for pretty much everything since I'd started, this was a growing team and there's no way that I could continue to be responsible for all those things. Senior managers needed their diaries managed properly. We needed a more robust onboarding process. And we also needed to think about things like employee benefits and all the things you take for granted when you work for a large company. It was only really by working for a larger, more established company beforehand that I was able to recognise the importance of all these functions and not have any kind of clue or idea as to where to start when it came to outsourcing them. We ended up outsourcing some key functions like payroll, and we enlisted some of the services of an external HR consultant who actually all wrote up all those policies that I'd started to write all those months ago. This was the first time probably in my career where I actually felt like I could act like a manager. I knew the office and the company inside out, and I was really comfortable answering any and all questions posed to me by the admin assistant that I had hired. Being in the environment right from the very start gave me so much confidence in what I was doing. If I'd started managing somebody in a larger organisation, I don't think I would have felt anywhere near as comfortable. So this is why I set up the Small Business Admin Network, and why it was so easy for me to get all these things in place. All those suppliers I'd worked with in those scaling up days were my Rolodex of contacts, and I reached out to them all. They were all really, really excited to be part of this network that I was building. And because I've used them all, I am able to recommend them all firsthand. So would I do it all again? I actually ended up being made redundant from ThinCats at the beginning of 2020. At the end of 2019, the board requested a change of leadership, and that CEO that I'd loved working with so much was replaced with somebody who had all this experience in huge multinational corporations. She came in and she reorganised the entire company from top to bottom, and she probably because she had a completely different perspective. And unfortunately, I was no longer required. I was utterly heartbroken that the company that I had lived and breathed for 4.5 years no longer needed me, and I took it really, really badly, and I was absolutely lost. However, if I was given the opportunity to go and work again at a company which had not yet even been incorporated, and had any phones or computers when I worked in on my first day, 100% yes, I would. Absolutely. The purpose and fulfillment that I got from that role was nothing I had ever experienced before. Never, ever have I ever felt more important or more needed within an organisation. And if I thought right at the start that my journey was only going to last 4.5 years, I would still go back and do it all again. It was the best job I have ever had in my life. So thank you for watching me on this webinar, or if you're watching me on the Executive Secretary YouTube channel. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to me on any of the websites or email address or social media that you see up on the screen now. Thank you very much.